This is Wednesday, the 21st of July, 2021. Welcome to IQ, or Inconvenient Questions International, on Dive. I'm your host. My name is Vishwa Sadashivan, and I hail from Singapore. IQ is committed to fostering deeper understanding, empathy, and involvement through meaningful, informed conversations across boundaries. We want to hear from people directly involved. Today, we talk about Hong Kong. Earlier this month, the Chinese Communist Party celebrated its 100th birthday, and President Xi Jinping made clear what China's stance is with Hong Kong and Taiwan. Discussions about democracy often evoke strong emotions, strong sentiments, as they deal with the very core of human aspirations, about freedom, liberty, and destiny. In the past 3 years, we witnessed a heightened tempo in people of Hong Kong asserting self-determination, and this being met with decisive action by China. In the next hour and a half, we will strive to understand the present state of Hong Kong better as we seek to predict her future. To do this meaningfully, it is important that we first unpack Hong Kong's journey in the past 179 years. The current issue between Hong Kong and China can be traced back to the two Opium Wars between 1839 and 1856. This resulted in what was referred to by the Chinese as a century of humiliation, where China lost its wealth and standing as the most powerful force in Asia. President Xi Jinping described that page of Chinese history as one of humiliation and sorrow. Essentially, to correct its trade imbalance with China in the early 1800s, Britain significantly increased opium imports to China. To sustain an increased demand for opium, addiction levels were turned up. Now, this caused serious social and economic disruption in China. Even the imperial soldiers were addicted. The government made it illegal to possess or consume opium. In spite of this, illicit trade in opium continued to rise. In 1839, British warships destroyed a Chinese blockade. Now, this started the First Opium War. It ended in August of 1842 with the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing, where Hong Kong Island was ceded to the British. This was in August of 1842. The Second Opium War started in 1856, when the British sought to increase its trading rights. It ended in 1860, the war, with the capture of Beijing and the signing of a convention where much of Kowloon was ceded to the British. Now, to ensure greater certainty and security for its trading interests, on July 1st, 1898, an agreement was signed for Hong Kong and most of Kowloon to be leased to the British for a total of 99 years. That is, to be returned to China only on the 1st of July, 1997. As that deadline neared, Britain decided that it would negotiate an agreement to lay out the terms of the handover. This resulted in the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984. This is a very, very important turning point and something that constantly gets referred to, the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984. It was signed by ex-British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and her Chinese counterpart, Premier Zhao Ziyang. It outlined the principle of one country, two systems, where Hong Kong would retain a high degree of autonomy and freedom of speech. It also stated that Hong Kong's legal and judicial system would remain unchanged for 50 years. That is, until 2047. The declaration was deposited with the United Nations. The one country, two systems principle was enshrined in a document called the Basic Law, which is considered Hong Kong's mini-constitution, the Basic Law. The high degree of autonomy that Beijing pledged to grant Hong Kong has been a thorny subject since the 1997 handover. The issue was further exacerbated in June 2014 when the Chinese State Council released a white paper stating that Beijing had, quote, comprehensive jurisdiction, unquote, over Hong Kong. Now, this led to the umbrella movement of 2014, where tens of thousands of protesters, mainly students, took to the streets demanding universal suffrage. In August of 2014, Beijing proposed that all eligible voters could vote in 2017 to elect Hong Kong's chief executive. The condition, however, was that a 1,200-person nominating committee would pick the 2 to 3 candidates. Now, this was rejected by the pro-democracy activists as they saw most of the members of the committee being closely aligned with Beijing. The protesters failed to achieve what they demanded. Carrie Lam was elected chief executive in 2017 by the same committee of 1,200 people as in past contests. On the 3rd of April 2019, the Carrie Lam government proposed changes to legislation that would allow for criminal suspects to be extradited to China. Critics warned that this extradition bill has the potential to undermine Hong Kong's legal freedoms and intimidate or silence dissidents. Hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets, many for the first time, including civil servants. On the 1st of July 2019, the anniversary of the handing over of Hong Kong to China, protesters stormed the Legislative Council building and vandalized it. Beijing accused the USA and Britain of stoking tensions in the city. On the 21st of July, protesters defaced China's liaison office in Hong Kong. China warned the protesters not to play with fire and not to mistake restraint for weakness. There were violent clashes between the protesters and the police. On the 12th of August 2019, protesters occupied the airport terminal, leading to hundreds of flights being cancelled. On the 4th of September, Carrie Lam announced she would withdraw the extradition bill, but it was seen as being too late and too little. After a few months of calm, on the 30th of June 2020, on the eve of the handover of Hong Kong, China passed a wide-ranging national security law, making it easier to punish protesters and silence dissidents. Pro-democracy activists say it curtails freedom of speech and is an insult to Hong Kong's basic law. China insists it's aimed at returning stability to a country tainted with foreign ideals. The national security law has had a chilling effect on the ground, especially for activists and pro-democracy players. Those found guilty will not be allowed to stand for public office. The new security office in Hong Kong, with its own Beijing-appointed enforcement personnel, can send cases to be tried in mainland China. People suspected of breaking the law can be wiretapped and put under surveillance. On June the 15th, 2020, US President Trump orders an end to Hong Kong's special status. On November 11th, 2020, Hong Kong expels 4 opposition legislators after Beijing passes a resolution allowing this. The following day, the remaining 15 opposition members resign in protest from the 70-seat Legislative Council. In January of 2021, more than 50 pro-democracy activists are arrested on suspicion of breaking the national security law. On March 30th, 2021, China finalizes an overhaul of Hong Kong's electoral system to ensure only patriots, as defined by China, rule the city. In June 17, 2021, authorities raided the premises of the pro-democracy newspaper Apple Daily as part of a national security investigation. A week later, Apple Daily prints its last edition. US President Joe Biden calls the closure a sad day for media freedom. So much has happened in a short space of time. Are we seeing the beginning of the end of Hong Kong? Or are we seeing the beginning of a new Hong Kong? Are China's actions on Hong Kong illegal, unethical, or is China acting within its sovereign right? Realistically, what are the options for Hong Kong going forward? To help us understand these issues better, we have with us 4 people from Hong Kong, passionate, informed, and experienced. Brian Wong, Rhodes Scholar and founder and editor-in-chief of the Oxford Political Review, the DPhil in Politics. Christine Low, Chief Development Strategist, Institute for the Environment, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and former Hong Kong legislator and Undersecretary for the Environment, and former CEO of Civic Exchange, a think tank. Jason Yip, Chief Executive Officer of MWYO, an independent think and do tank on youth matters in Hong Kong. He was also a former diplomatic delegate of the International Committee of the Red Cross stationed in Afghanistan, Myanmar, and other jurisdictions. Last but certainly not least, Johnson Yong, democracy and labor rights advocate and digital security educator, and former convener of the Hong Kong Civil Human Rights Front. We in IQI feel it critical to actively listen to the voice of reason that youths bring. So for every IQI discussion, we have an international panel of youths to keep us in check. Today, we have three bright young people. Jenny Tang from Hong Kong, a 2020 Cambridge University graduate in anthropology, currently assistant researcher with the think tank in Hong Kong. Tanushree Roy from India. She is a lawyer and domestic mediator and trainer. She has deep interest in public policy and has worked for the United Nations and the Delhi State Legal Services Authority. Lin Po Chen, born in Taiwan and moved to Singapore at the age of 8, third-year undergraduate student reading a double degree in politics, philosophy and economics, and infosystems. We now kick off the discussion with a question I would ask my panelists to respond to in no more than 3 minutes each. Are we seeing the beginning of the end of Hong Kong, or are we seeing the beginning of a new Hong Kong? Over to you guys. Anyone? Brian, perhaps we can start with you.
Sure. I think it's important to make 2 points very clear, and I will be very concise as much as is possible. The first is that many elements of the old Hong Kong as we know it are no longer here. But secondly, the extent to which the new Hong Kong diverges from the old Hong Kong remains to be seen. And I'll explain why I believe in both of these statements concurrently. The first is to note that inevitably, ever since the handover, there have been seismic political changes. And let's cast aside this dichotomous description concerning whether or not there's been more democratization or rollback. Because in all honesty, after the vetoing of the bill in 2015, I don't think there's been any substantive progress in terms of the advocacy for formal democracy, although the most noteworthy changes and advances of democracy were accomplished in the era of the early 2000s and also 2010, when democratization occurred under a joint effort by or liaison and negotiation between the Democratic Party and also Beijing. Let's set that aside for now, though. The reality is, on the front of whether it be the language, the social cultural aspects of Hong Kong, the way the political and civil order works in Hong Kong, there have been radical transformations. Whether or not this is good or whether or not this is bad obviously depends on whom you ask. If you ask someone who's on the streets in 2019 what they felt about Hong Kong, their perspective would be very different from someone who believed that those on the streets were ostensibly rioters and individuals to be prosecuted. And it is this deep gulf and divide in Hong Kong, one that demarcates a division between arguably 2 to 3 million in Hong Kong and the rest of the city, that I think is noteworthy in that first respect. So it is definitely the case that the old Hong Kong of pre-1997 British Hong Kong is probably no longer what we see today here on the streets in Hong Kong. Secondly, and very quickly, where not the new Hong Kong, so to speak, is to be welcome, I think depends fundamentally on if the government is able to resolve a lot of the problems that this city and the city's people have had to cope with and put up with over the past decades. And that's not just the socio-economic inequalities, but also the intransigent government, the deep mistrust between the public of Hong Kong and mainland China, and finally the relationship between Hong Kong and the rest of the world. So if you ask me, Vishwa, I think that the question is complex and the answer is equally complex, and there you have it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Christine, could we hear from you?
Sure. It's both the beginning and the end. If I look at politics, economics, and social, let me take politics first. It is clear that at this stage, Beijing's overwhelming concern about Hong Kong is security. I think it will be very tough on the aspects of just not wanting to see any of the activities that came about in 2019, and that the national security law is there to ensure none of those things are going to happen again. Apart from obviously security locally in Hong Kong, Beijing is also very concerned about the shift in geopolitics, and it sees that this is a difficult period for China because it is in some kind of um, uh, a rivalry, conflict, whatever the word we want to use, with the other major power in the world, the United States. So my conclusion on politics in Hong Kong is that it is going to be confined. Now, on economics, obviously, China wants to continue for Hong Kong to be successful. Hong Kong is a commercial, trading, and financial center, and Hong Kong's role will have to fit in also to how things might fall within a geopolitical context. Socially, locally in Hong Kong, there is a great contest relating to the people's sense of identity. Over the course of Hong Kong's colonial past, I think it's always been, who are the people of Hong Kong? They are ethnically Chinese. They may or may not have British nationality. Most of them really don't. And because of Hong Kong's history of turbulence in China's politics, many people have relatives overseas that have immigrated. So Hong Kong is one of those societies where people come and go. Also, in order for Hong Kong people to have a high sense of security, people have gone and got foreign nationality. So Hong Kong actually, amongst the ethnic Chinese, have a large proportion of people with passports from many, many countries. So at this stage, I think that sense of identity is being contested because Beijing is asking people about, where does your loyalty lie? Do you see yourself as Chinese? In which case, okay, let's talk about China. Or do you see yourself as a foreigner, and that it's convenient for Hong Kong people to kind of arbitrage their identity? And there are people today, because of the national security law, who are leaving Hong Kong because they don't feel, comfortable in the new Hong Kong anymore. So I think this is a difficult time. This sense of identity affects people individually, affects their children and, how they organize their personal life. And then finally, I just want to touch on the point that Brian brought along, which is how Hong Kong people see the local administration. And one of the problems with the local administration is people don't think it's been very effective. People don't think it's been effective in developing a positive relationship with Beijing in terms of properly explaining Hong Kong's issues, and that it has not been great in terms of performance. So I think it's not just the issue of not liking the Hong Kong government because it's seen as the lackey of Beijing, but I think these difficult times in Hong Kong has made it difficult for the government to perform. So let me leave things here for now.
Thank you, Christine. I think the term patriot has come up quite often in China's rhetoric, in demanding loyalty and looking for patriots to be the majority in the legislative council. Am I correct? There seems to be an emphasis on patriotism, loyalty, love for country.
I think China uses the word patriotism, which to a lot of people sound rather old-fashioned. You can also use the word loyalty. The reason I wanted to press this point is that Hong Kong people have, many of them have foreign nationality.
Exactly.
But they fully enjoy the benefits of residence in Hong Kong. And we're coming to a time where, because I think from Beijing's point of view, they see Hong Kong people as calling for, the downfall of the Chinese regime and going abroad to the United States, to call for punishment of China and Hong Kong officials, that these are signs of disloyalty, of being unpatriotic. And they're saying, essentially, these things are not allowed in other countries. And why are they happening in Hong Kong? So For those who want to be in politics, we want them to declare their loyalty.
Right, right. All right. Maybe we'll go to Jason first.
Okay.
Yep,
So
Jason.
I want to go back to the question of Wiswa, is whether it was the end or it would be the new beginning for Hong Kong.
Right.
I think it can be both way, because we can never have options to go back to the old Hong Kong because the situation have changed. The miracle of Hong Kong depends on a lot of factors, from geopolitics to the domestic situation of China and the role of Hong Kong and all in history. And definitely from geopolitical points of view, the context is no longer different, because the international community may not want to give the same status or the same situations that China or Hong Kong used to have. So I don't think it is irrelevant to talk about whether we can go back to the old model of Hong Kong. So that means we need to move on. We need to find a new way, how we want to position this city as a gateway of China. And given the geopolitical context that China and US may set in Asia. And I think I want to echo a little bit what Christine and Brian a little bit touch upon, is about the relations between the local community, especially the youth, because they are the focus of the student movement from 2014 down the way until 2019. Is the relations and the trust between them and the local administrations here in Hong Kong. Because definitely they have taken a huge part in the movement in 2019. And now the momentum is still there. Although the national security law have put everything, in a pretty calm format, but you can feel the momentum among the youth still there, with a bit of dissatisfaction or somehow maybe disappointment. I think because of my organization, we have been studying the channels or the possibility how the youth can actually participate or express their will towards the civil affairs or participate in the social affairs in the current system of Hong Kong. But unfortunately, most of the channels that we have studied, no matter we have the very district or community level committee, that normally is the entry ticket for people get into the public affairs of Hong Kong. They normally require lots of titles, experience, or human connections before an individual can get into the pipeline, into the political power or participations in the social affairs of Hong Kong. So that's why it leads to a situation that the local administration is actually governing or running Hong Kong based on a very limited number of people. I think to put it another way, if Hong Kong need to move to the next stage or the new chapter, apart from the more global context of geopolitics, domestically, there's a lot of things we need to fix. And one of the things is how we can re-engage the youth between the local administrations and the youth themselves. Yeah, I think I will stop here.
So you are emphasizing the apparent disconnect between youths and who form the bulk of the protesters and the local government, Hong Kong government. Am I correct? Understand that?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. There's a clear
disconnect, distrust.
Exactly.
But would you say that there's also a disconnect between the youth, what the youth want, and what the rest of Hong Kong society wants? Is there a disconnect?
I think I don't call it disconnect. It's actually a discrepancy, because Hong Kong as a city itself, we are facing the worst Guinness index. I mean the disparity between the rich and the poor as a city in the world. So when we talk about the youth, there's a lot of different dimensions. You can cut them into different sectors. You have the very rich class of the youth, and you have a very grassroots one. So they have definitely different kinds of demand. But generally speaking, yes, the youth facing a lot of challenges, like the upward social mobility, the way how they see themselves when the new setup of the city kinds of limiting their possibility to develop further in terms of a lot of things. But at the same time, you have the adult or the middle class. They are pretty much want to, like what you say, Wiswa, is like, I want to keep the game going on, the same game. So I think I don't call it disconnect, but everyone see the problem of the youth. I think the government officials see it also, but it's not easy to bring a balance or to change it without changing the system per se.
Right. Thank you. Johnson, are you ready to come on?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So
Sorry for the
what's your view? Perhaps you could, if I could ask you to respond to the point raised by Jason about the discrepancy in perception of the youth, what the youth want, their aspirations, and the rest of society, including the government.
Sure. Very quick. I missed most of Jason's sharing. Sorry for that. But I can speak. As a youth, holding accountability, seeking truth is one of the things, of course, to deal with the grievances issues. And I want to quickly touch on the point made by Christine about patriotism. We can use. I can name a few names: Wang Quanzhang, Wang Yi, Li Heping. They are all lawyers in China who have been trying to advocate procedural justice, and they have always been trying to follow the rules and the laws laid by the Chinese government and also referencing the judicial procedures. They were never trying to challenge the very legitimacies of the Communist Party, and yet they are framed as not patriot, and they are charged with incitement and endangering national security. So I think there's one fact that we need to acknowledge, that is the definitions of patriotism always change. And this is why some Hong Kong people will refer the current national security law not as a red line, but a red sea. And without acknowledging this uncertainty and unpredictability of what Chinese government are thinking, and I believe everyone in here doesn't have a very clear sense about what preferences Chinese government had, and it's very hard to demand people who are in the pro-democracy camp to try to understand and trying to comply with the demands or the red line laid by the Chinese government. And another point I want to make is I want to share a very little story. Precisely 2 years ago today, more than 200 armed thugs dressed in white, chanting for government slogan, had waged an indiscriminatory attack against citizens on the street with their fists, with weapon cans and steel rods. Despite some victims kneel on the ground beg for mercy, they were still attacked. They were attacked on the train. Children, elderly, journalists were also attacked. And later we learned police were all along monitoring the situation. And not only they didn't step in, they escort the attackers safely.
You are referring to the Yunlong incident?
Yes. I'm referring to the Yunlong incident, and today is July 21st. Precisely 2 years ago, this happened. According to research done by CHK Journalism School, overnight, the police and the government lost their trust from the people. And we are 2 years from the attack, from the incidents. Only 8 attackers were put on trials, and dozens of victims are prosecuted for rioting. And then the authorities show no interest in finding the people who orchestrated the attack, and the police officer who failed their job in protecting the civilians got promoted. And when journalists attempt to seek truth, they are sacked, they are arrested, and they are prosecuted. This has reflected a very inconvenient truth in Hong Kong. That is, in the past 2 years since the arrest, although a lot of people in the pro-establishment, especially those who are in the elite class, has been advocating we should move on, we should look forward, and call for restorations of unity and national identity. They never tried to resolve what had happened in 2019, and they were not seeking accountability and truth, and thus there is no reconciliations. Any big plan on the directions of a community, namely how Hong Kong should go forward, have to acknowledge the state of mind of the people, the political cleavage and collective experiences that might have huge implications to the reliability of the political agenda. And the fact is, the government in Hong Kong has never regained trust and legitimacy from its people, and any top-down policy making would face massive stumbling blocks, which is reflected by the well-spread vaccination hesitation in the city. We are at a state where more than 1/4 of our populations are under depression, and this is a study made by HKU and education universities. Combined with the factor of COVID and massive wave of immigration and shrinking civic space, all this has amplified the psychological burdens of the people. And although rubber bullets and petrol bomb has retreated from the street, the trauma levels among the Hong Kong people are similar to those who are in a conflict zone.
Right.
So,
so I hear
yeah.
you. I hear you. I'd ask for a pause at this point in time. Essentially, you're talking about the loss of trust between the youth, between the people on the streets who took to the streets, and the government and the police. And unless this matter is openly talked about, resolved, and there's a closure, you're saying it's very hard to move forward. I'd like to invite Brian. Brian, I see your hand up. Maybe you want to respond.
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to say thank you very much, Johnson, for your candid sharing just then. I want to make two quick comments here. And the first is, it's high time that we call a spade a spade. What happened in Yuen Long on January the 21st was essentially, as you said, a group of white-clothed, white-dressed mob essentially hounding civilians on a train. And I think the lack of accountability and lack of redress or independent investigation 2 years in is a problem. So I think you're absolutely right on that front. And the best means to rebuilding police and civilian trust is have a fair and even-handed investigation into all aspects of not just the protest, but also the movement and also the government's failures and lack of accountability in relation to that. That's something I personally championed way back in July 2019, and I still champion to this very day. And I think you're absolutely right to say that to have violence, vigilante violence, unpunished, and to have the law seen as being selectively enforced is not conducive towards reconciliation. That's point number one. Point number two, on the NSL and the Red Sea and a lack of certainty. So what you said actually reminds me of an article I read from the Stand News, where there was an analogy between what's going on in Hong Kong with a Red Sea. And I think what I would say there is, if you juxtapose the national security law in Hong Kong against the national security law's implementation in the mainland, you'll find that, ironically or functionally, a lot of the companies, a lot of the businesses operating in the mainland would have arguably more confidence in how the law is enacted in the mainland of China as compared with Hong Kong, which is a Chinese city for sure, but the ways in which the law has been enacted and implemented has not been reassuring to many folks in the city. And I guess the question there then is, how ought we confront this? Some say it's about explaining the law better. Others say it's inherently a flaw of the law. Whereas I think the argument I want to advance here is that fundamentally in the transitory period, when the law is being implemented, there's a danger of overkill, of local actors and also provincial actors or actors involved in decision-making interpreting the need to implement the law to the max as therefore essentially granting them carte blanche in taking the law to the maximum. That is when I think we have reason to be worried and to have concerns about the means through which the law is implemented. And that is where constructive debate, to the extent it's still possible, must be had and held, because that too is why Hong Kongers feel disillusioned, feel worried, and concerned about the future. My question, and this I'm going to finish very quickly, I think my question that I would invite everyone to think about here is what realistically can we do to convince the establishment, to convince those in positions of power, to convince those who hold access to the corridors of power to care for these concerns, to assuage the worries of many in Hong Kong. And I think that's a question that might point our discussion tonight in a more illuminating and pragmatic direction. So thank you very much for that.
Right. Thank you, Brian. So your point essentially is that there must be a more effective way to communicate the discontentment, the concerns, and the interests of the people of Hong Kong to Beijing. And you're suggesting that the people of Hong Kong have to find that the appropriate and effective way to get the message across. and the current methods may not be yielding results. That's what I'm hearing. Is there a quick response from you, Johnson? A very quick one?
Sure. So an effective way in holding the authority, especially the executive branch, accountable is to have an investigative committee in the legislative council. This is what, democratic countries and, Hong Kong used to do in finding wrongdoings about the government. But instead, the government has banned almost all oppositions and pro-democracy kind of people from running any genuine political decision-making process. And history in Myanmar or Malaysia and many places around the world have shown us when the regime separate a significant identity groups from the political classes, they sought the seat for another round of political turmoil or violences and stumbling block for better social transformation. So my point in here is, in order to save space, a safe base for the officials, and in order to escape from the issues of accountability, national security law and other colonial law are used right now to protect those who are in power, who are having vested interests. And this has become a deadlock, and it is the government that makes Hong Kong go into another round of vicious cycle.
Right. Okay, thank you. Could we hear from the youth panel? From Jenny, Tanushree, Ho Chien, any comments? Questions? Yes, Ho Chien.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so I just want to bring up again on the whole big theme of mistrust and distrust, as what we have mentioned previously on enforcement of law, and how it is unreliable because there tends to be an overkill. And yeah, I was discussing this with the team that invited me, and I was telling them how I feel that trust is not really the right word we are looking for, because when we talk about trust, there's always the issue of the person who is being vulnerable, which in this case would be Hong Kong. And there's the people who are in power demanding the trust. So trust necessarily creates an offerer and offeree dynamic. You always have one person offering the trust to the other. And in doing so, we come to exemplify the identity split between the two. Like we have previously discussed just now, many Hong Kongers are being born, some of them are overseas, some of them are transient, some of them have never set foot on the mainland even. And I myself, I'm born in Taiwan and I migrated to Singapore. So identity itself is a very complex topic, and it's one that's very close to our heart. Some of you might have heard about this this piece of literature called Orphan of Asia, which describes how someone in Taiwan back in the Japanese occupation era felt like they were neither Japanese nor Chinese. And I think in the same way, Hong Kong is feeling neither British nor Chinese, and the natural answer to that is we are Hong Kongers. We are different people. And yeah, so naturally the tension is that it is against the in 1997 it's already against the Chinese officials to work around, and I suppose the transition didn't go that well. So what this all means for us is that trust building in itself is very important. We need to find the right language. We need to find the right things to do. Apologies, amendments, and most importantly, perhaps what's the best for the Chinese, the mainlanders, is to play things out, to use time to slowly naturalize and integrate them back into the fold of society before we can talk more about changing laws and changing more to how Hong Kongers behave. Yeah,
Right.
and I feel like this issue that's not sensitive. Yeah.
Good. Thanks a lot, Ho Chien. Tanushree, over to you, Tanushree.
Thank you, sir. So when you're talking about the question of trust between members of the civil society and the governments, I feel that if there are certain actions which are circumventing constitutional limits, it points towards the need to introspect and assess why it's happening and signals all democratic pillars to buckle up and start doing their job. I mean, as citizens also, we cannot absolve ourselves of the responsibility to hold these institutions accountable. As our earlier panelist Brian mentioned, that a free and fair investigation is absolutely imperative, which will also, in the end also help us communicate interests and concerns of the people at large. And it has happened, and it can happen as it has happened in the past. For example, in the case of the Watergate scandal, where Nixon had to resign due to the investigations done by journalists. So I feel all stakeholders, the state, the citizens, the youth, the oversight committees, the press play a very, very major role towards this end. And further elaborating on the process through which this can be done, I feel that there are certain broad principles on which democracies and other civil societies function, with the freedom of speech and expression being an integral part. So legal civil action, as by the civil society, is a right and should be allowed. And it is the duty of the institutions in a democracy, to protect this right, to allow such action to happen and not let the governments overshadow and curtail these freedoms outside the scope of their constitution. And it is our responsibility as citizens to make this possible.
Right. You're perhaps talking about an ideal state, and there's a disjoint between what is ideal, what ought to be done, and what the reality might be. I think that's the issue as well that we have to tackle, right? But your point is taken. Jenny, you want to say something? Johnson and Jason, I see your hands up. I'll come to you soon. But let me go to Jenny first.
Yes, I'd like to add something too at some stage. This is Christine.
Sure, Christine. I'll come to you later. With Jenny?
Yes, okay. So first of all, just thank you everyone so much for your perspective. And then I want to begin from Vishwa's question on whether this is an end or a new beginning of Hong Kong. So from how I see it, both of these terms actually imply a fissure, this juncture, transition of some sort, whether it's an end or a new beginning. So I very much agree with quite a few of the previous speakers on how I think at this point in time, we have to think about how we can move on and perhaps find ways to pursue the sort of community or life that each of us may want in different ways and may see or perceive in different ways. And so I do agree that I think actually Brian, Christine, and Jason have all mentioned that we have to find ways to communicate with the government and authorities effectively on how we can address some of the discontent and interests of the people that have been left unaddressed for the past 2 years or beyond. But I think beyond that, I also wonder if it is worth exploring avenues beyond the obviously political, by which I mean directly engaging with the authorities in power, to create a sort of community that we want. Is there anything we can do, as Tanushi just talked about right now, as the civil society? Is there anything we can do amongst ourselves to address a lot of the issues that Hong Kong is facing, with regard to the political situation and regardless of the political situation, such as the discrepancies or inequalities in terms of wealth, class, race, ethnicity, and gender among citizens of Hong Kong. So I think building trust and developing accountability is not only something that happens between the citizen and the government, but also among different groups of citizens in the city. So I think that's something I'm interested in exploring further. Thank you.
That's an interesting point, Jenny, that trust is not just vertical, it's also horizontal. It's between stakeholders in society, not just between the government and the people. I'll go quickly to Jason. A quick comment, Jason, so that we can get more comments coming in. Jason, then Johnson, and Jason, Christine, and then Johnson.
Yep,
Okay, Jason,
I think, thanks a lot, Wiswa. I think a number of speakers here about the issue from the perspective of politics, investigations, and all these kinds of things. Especially Johnson have repeated a few times that the only way to do reconciliation is about we need an independent investigation to check what had happened, and we need apologies from the authority. I think this is what is clear to everyone. But at the same time, I want to add something more concrete. Is that the independent investigation is the only solution or the way out for the deadlock that we are facing here in Hong Kong? I think it's one of the many or one of the few possible solutions. It's not the only one. Definitely, we have a deadlock over there. The government may not want to respond immediately or still delaying. But if they are not responding to that, is that like the community should just stop and we don't think of other solution? I think it's more optimistic or encouraging if we come up with other situation. That is, I think, what Jenny was actually talking about. One of the situation I want to bring up here is, yes, politics, legitimacy, legal investigation, all important. But think about from 2019, we still have more than 8,000 young adults under the age of 35. They were arrested. Some of them already prosecuted, and most of them are still in the pipeline. I think, yes, while we are still waiting for the possibility to have the investigation for the incident in Yunnan and whatever, I think it's actually more burning. What about the futures, the development of these young adults below 35? They have quite good educational background. I think instead of keep arguing who are the wrongdoer and where is the investigation and whatever, the community and the authorities should actually find a way out for these 8,000 plus young adults in Hong Kong, because they cannot just keep waiting or dragging in the judicial system and see whether they will be prosecuted one day. To the city as a whole, if these people can be free from any worry and to resume their so-called normal life, is the best to the city. So we cannot keep everything in all together and hope to solve the deadlock as one miracle. I think we have to step by step to reduce the size of the problem, the trouble. Investigation is one issue, but we have many more issues that we can actually work on, at the same time. Thanks a lot.
Christine, over to you.
Yes, I'd like to follow up on this string of thoughts that various people have brought up. I just want to touch on the issue of overkill. I think it's an important point because I think at this difficult time in Hong Kong, we're all trying to look for, and we're all trying to listen to each other, and I don't mean just in this program, in terms of where some are, where there may be some openings for us to, move ahead. There are many people on a day-to-day basis who are trying to put out narratives and stories through the media, through social media, which are being followed by people in government and also, I think, by the Beijing authorities, just to listen to what's there. So the overkill is important because I think what Brian said was, let's make sure that when we have these new laws, tough laws, national security laws, that a lot of people in Hong Kong, the lawyers, the judiciary and others who are commenting on it, let's make sure that we put out our views on some of these things in a way that could be heard and digested, because they could have an influence. So that's my first suggestion. My second suggestion is we tend very much in our conversations to use examples and to put narratives in a way as part of Western liberal construction, if I can put it that way. So we are talking about apologies. We're talking about investigation. We're talking about these ideas of arriving at a new stage where things could be discussed and resolved in the longer term. So I wonder, and I actually don't know what the answer is. Instead of using perhaps Western liberal tradition examples, are there any examples, right? Are there any examples from Asia that we can start building the kind of narratives to talk about these deeper issues that needs to be addressed and resolved in the longer term? Whether by flushing them out, having perhaps a fresher discussion about them, that it would open the door to perhaps people who didn't want to listen to this point of view anymore to actually be willing to hear what people are saying.
Yes, so it's a very interesting point that you've raised, and it's quite similar to what Jason is talking about. Instead of using some of the tried and tested Western approaches in the form of investigation, things that are in the public eye, it may not suit, it may not actually serve the goal or be as effective in bridging the gap, in the communication gap in Asian societies. And especially when there's a big difference in terms of power between the parties, like between Beijing and the protesters, for example, or the people of Hong Kong. So I think it's a very interesting starting point to talk about. Let's explore different ways of getting the message across, and getting resolutions or conciliation need not be in the form of open and transparent investigation or declaration of guilt. And I think that's an interesting point for us to think about, because it's a similar conversation that's going on in a country like Singapore. As you know, it's been one government since 1959, and we are talking about an era where the young people in Singapore do want to assert their voice a lot more. And what seems to work is having behind the scenes conversations, not in the open, but behind the scenes conversations, so that people in authority, people in positions of power, don't end up being defensive because of fear of losing face. This is an interesting point. Quickly, I'd like to go to Johnson and then to Brian.
I would like to respond on the terminology. I mean, we can use any terminology we want. We can even reference from the Chinese Communist traditions about redefining some historical problems. But ultimately, we have to agree on the content of what we are going to do, which is still the same: seeking responsibility, accountability, and seeking truth. And when we talked about moving to a new stage, I actually don't agree with that. I have a lot of problem with this terminology. It is like we are really moving forward, and it is like 2019 is something that is way past. But this isn't true. The legacies, the hatred, the grievances, and the divisions that emerged in 2019 is still haunting Hong Kong people. And the crackdown and the response of the government is still haunting Hong Kong people, reinforcing the political cleavage, reinforcing the bias. And that is why, we have to stress that we need to resolve what had happened 2 years ago and subsequently the developments in Hong Kong. And the truth is, there are a lot of people who are not only trying to lobby the government to, restrict their wrongdoing or restrict their power. There are journalists out there who is trying to seek truth, but subsequently they are being silenced. I see there, and I want to add just one point on building trust. The preconditions of reconciliations and trust in many conflict zones is to cease fire. And if the fire continues, if one side is keep on cracking down on the other side, where are the foundations for such trust building? And the problem another problem we have, and this is coming from a personal experience. I personally engage in some dialogue of, peace and reconciliations. And under this political environment in Hong Kong, where teachers are being witch hunting, students are being imposed with patriotic education, there's no safe space for people who are traumatized to talk about their experience genuinely, and thus go to a stage where they can build trust. So in order to create a safe space, one must reinforce institutional protections to human rights so that people who engage in this space will not be retaliated. But we are not seeing that happening. But instead, we see a destruction of institution, a removal of rule of law, and manipulations of the political forces.
Okay, Brian, over to you.
Great. So I spent years studying sort of Hegelian dialectics, so I'm going to do a very dialectical thing of just trying to offer a synthesis of what's been going on in this discussion so far. I want to just break this question of accountability or how to move forward, etc., into 3 different levels. The first is a normative, the second is a prescriptive, and the third is the pragmatic, or if you're a critical theorist, a praxis. First, on the normative question, I agree with everyone, or a large majority of folks in this panel, that there's been fault and there's blame, that there should be blame and also the holding accountable of individuals that transgressed, that derelicted and violated their offices and duties. I don't think anyone here is disputing the normative validity of this proposition. And indeed, that should be the case in a civilized society. Vigilante, violence, arson, destruction, hounding of individuals for their political beliefs and views ought not be tolerated. And I think that applies to all parties, to all individuals. So if we are indeed to hold individuals accountable in accordance with what is normatively desirable, I would say responsibility is a necessary ingredient. And that takes me on to the prescriptive. Now, this is where I disagree slightly with, Jason and also Christine. And I actually think in order for us to move on, we still need to reconcile with the structural roots of the problems of 2019 and think very carefully about where and how the movement came about. Whether it be the initial misjudgment and miscalibration of the popular will, the subsequent miscommunication and misalignment between Beijing and the Hong Kong public, and all the miscellaneous extraneous harms and episodes of egregious transgressions that occurred during those months of summer in 2019, I think we need to learn from them. We need to extract the lessons from them in order to move on. And I don't believe, therefore, that, we can just forget about it and move on. I don't think that's what necessarily Christine or Jason's saying, by the way. I'm just pointing that I don't think that's a position that we ought to adopt. So on a prescriptive level, again, we need to learn from the past. We also need to think about the present. And the present is there's 1 million individuals that received under the poverty line in Hong Kong. That there are loads of youth who, as Jason points out quite aptly, are shut out of prospective careers because they're essentially locked up in behind bars or await trial. And I don't know when they're going to be put into court. It might be 2023, might be 2024. It's not clear when. And the reality is, because of COVID and also the socio-economic unrest and all that has occurred, we now end up with unemployment rates that are a problem. So we also need to think about the present and how we ought to tackle these issues, to ameliorate them in order to move on. But a final note, Vishwa, and apologies for being so is just on a pragmatic note. I want to note that given the political constraints, given the realities that we're in, if we are indeed to advance these goals, which is a question I often put to my friends from both sides of the aisle, from all camps in Hong Kong, what are we to do? And that is a question I don't think I have an answer to. But I would suggest that it must rest with not just seeking reconciliation or justice, but ultimately finding a way for Hong Kongers, for Hong Kong, to navigate the increasingly complex political quagmire that is international relations and also the escalating US-China tensions. And that, I think, is the utmost imperative in face of what we've been confronting and a conundrum that presents itself. And if we are to take a side, especially one that actively jeopardizes and puts at risk all of those who are staying behind in Hong Kong, I think it would be deeply reckless and irresponsible to do that, to take an explicit side that contravenes the interests of the largest majority of those who remain behind in Hong Kong. And that is what I would therefore like to suggest to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. That is very impassioned. Jason, I'll come to you and then Po Chien. But I would need you to keep it short. Right? Thank you. Jason?
Yeah, promised. I want to quickly respond to Johnson about the ceasefire example because I don't think it's appropriate or accurate. Because in a war zone situation like Afghanistan and whatever, the ceasefire happens like between two parties that officially occupy some territory or authority. The Hong Kong situation is like the administration, no matter you like it or not, they have the responsibility and role to enforce law and order. So I think this is point number one. And the second thing is about building trust. Yes, once again, investigation and those kind of things are important. But I'm going back to the first point that Brian raised at the very beginning, is the governance issue. Whether we can actually solve some other problems in Hong Kong as a way for the administration to build trust, to improve the quality of the governance of the city. There's a few questions here I want everyone here in the discussion to think about. Going back to the 8,000 young adults, they are still in the pipeline of judicial sentence and whatever. whether we think about the employment once some of them are released from the prison system, or whether we can actually encourage the administration to think about other kinds of penalty. For example, it's not necessary to send everyone to the prison. Whether we can actually have other treatment as a way those who violate the law in 2019, they fulfill their responsibility. But at the same time, it's not like they all have to be sent to the prison. We can always have a creation, have other alternative solutions so that everyone in the society can be satisfied with the way out. That's what I want to add.
Right. Thank you, Jason. Ho-Chien?
Yeah, I just want to quickly speak to Christine's point, which I don't quite I'm not able to process, because what I'm hearing essentially is that it is not Chinese to apologize publicly, which I find rather strange, because that's exactly what the Chinese people has been requesting from Japan all these years, right? Be it Taiwan, be it Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, China. We have all been trying to do the same thing. We've been asking the Japanese, can you apologize publicly for what is wrong? Surely we have a sense of justice. Surely there's a sense of when something is wrong, we have to address it. And that's why I'm inclined to agree with Brian. I don't think that it is anything un-Chinese or culturally insensitive to apologize.
I didn't actually say that, but
all right,
I'm
please
sorry
clarify. Yes. Thank you.
I didn't actually say that.
Yeah.
So I don't want
Because
it to
didn't
continue. Yeah, I didn't actually say that. What I said was,
Okay.
are there, for example, let's take an example that Jason has been putting out. He's calling for whether the 8,000 people who have been charged could be treated in some way that is not heading for prison. I don't know what the answer is, but if what we're trying to say is, can we do something? Can we propose something? Can we develop a narrative where society, and this, I'm afraid, includes people up in Beijing, and you could say the establishment side, that there are perhaps other ways to look at it. Are there ways that we can draw from Asian society? As I said, I also don't quite know what the answer is. But I'm trying to think of how to have different ways, maybe not so absolute ways to deal with it. And I can see why people say, well, is it about an apology? Or if we want justice, isn't it about putting it out there? And aren't the Chinese demanding this too? Actually, if we leave those things aside, maybe we can be more creative to think of how we might deal with just 8,000 people in this particular case. So sometimes if we go back into our set narratives, and I don't necessarily disagree with them, the set narrative often does not allow us to go forward. That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that's very clear. Jenny?
Yes, I take your point. Thank you.
Jenny? Jenny, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. I want to try to address both Jonathan's point and Christine's point, and kind of along the same line in terms of the terminology that we use and how we imagine things. So, I think Jonathan mentioned that he took problem with how we discuss about the idea of moving forward. And I think it's very true that it's important to know that moving forward doesn't mean that we forget the past, but that we actively seek for solutions that help us reconcile with the past and address things that need to be addressed. And then moving on to Christine's point, I think it's very much along the same kind of argument or idea that in order to move forward, perhaps we should also look beyond the sorts of language and imaginations that we have been going with, and things such as freedom, democracy, accountability, justice, freedom of press, freedom of speech, whatever that has been dominating the political imagination of Hong Kong or many protesters or young people's minds. But I think I very much agree with that in the sense that these absolute terms, a lot of them are inherited from specific strands of political philosophy and are not the one and only way of thinking about things. But I think there's also this dilemma that I personally think exists, which is that a lot of people in Hong Kong do genuinely believe in those ideas and do genuinely want to strive for those ideas. But at the same time, I personally take quite a pessimistic view in that I don't think it's very hopeful or effective to engage with the authorities by directly putting forward those ideas in how they have been articulated among a lot of people. So the question that I want to put forward is, how do we reconcile those differences perhaps in terms of values or in what people genuinely desire for themselves or for their families and communities? What is the way forward, or what can we do when we do have the differences between different people in our collective community?
How do we reconcile the different viewpoints? And that's precisely what I'm hearing. There's so many different viewpoints, and every viewpoint is valid. And how do we now bring them together and deal with the realities that are confronting us? I'll come to that in a while, but first, Tanushree, you have something to say?
All right. Thank you, sir. So I think we are moving our discussions, we're discussing about different avenues of resolution. We've talked about how to build trust within the community, what we can do to improve the internal situation. Basically, we're turning our focus from the past to the future. So I'm just going to expand on the question which Jenny has put as to, reconciling internal differences and differences of thought and interest. We realize that the international community can and is trying to come together to support Hong Kong in various ways. But to what extent can these measures really result in the intended outcome? In other words, given the power gap between the two parties, what are the various factors that can actually propel China to engage in peace talks? And what role can the international community play in the same?
Well, that's an interesting question. As we all know, the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken just last month said, and I quote, "Over the past year, China has continued to dismantle Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy in violation of its obligations under the Sino-British Joint Declaration of '84 and Hong Kong's Basic Law." Now, the question is this true from a legal point of view? And actually, my own understanding is that the declaration itself does not have a mechanism endorsed by both parties. In this case, it's China and Britain, to ensure its compliance, right? And as far as the UN intervention is concerned, even though the agreement was registered with the UN, it did not include mechanisms of supervision. So the point here is, when countries like the USA, countries like UK, and countries in the EU, they make strong statements. Quite often, these statements can end up being a kiss of death. They may not end up actually helping the situation in Hong Kong. It only gets China, for example, to dig in their heels and use stronger measures. So, as to your question, Tanushree, what exactly can the international community do at this point in time? My own sense is, at this point in time, I think it's best to leave it to the parties directly involved in Hong Kong, and China, to find ways to reconcile the differences. Number one, to reconcile the differences between Hong Kong and Beijing, right? And whether the approach should be an open investigation or whether it should be behind the scenes, that can be decided. But first of all, that needs to be reconciled. The key word is reconciliation. And I hear loud and clear, Johnson, Brian, in fact, all of us actually being of the view that you can't move forward without reconciling the past. And the past, we are referring to 2019. We can't move forward without dealing with 8,000 people, who are deciding on what's going to happen, whose fate is going to be decided very soon. So with so many things hanging in the air, you can't quite move forward as a collective, as a society. But the question I have for all of us here is, we are dealing with China, which actually has the authority. And I believe the National People's Congress Standing Committee holds the ultimate power of interpreting the Basic Law. So it is actually China's sovereign right to introduce the law, introduce a security law, and so on. Now, even if it is not within its sovereign right, the question is, what is it that can be done? Is challenging China, challenging Beijing directly through street protests, especially with the promulgation of the security law, going to reap any results? That's the question I'd like to put to all of you. Any takers, please?
Yes, I think, let me go first.
Yes, please.
I think from when we're trying to talk about who's around the table, right, or who you want around the table,
yes,
to start thinking about reconciliation. Obviously, the mainland, Beijing, is one of the stakeholders you need, and for us to have in Hong Kong a good dialogue and understanding with Beijing, we need to thoroughly understand its point of view. And so it's not a matter of whether we are going to give up whatever we think and agree with them, but we need to have a thorough understanding of their point of view. And their point of view didn't necessarily start in 2019. In fact, nobody's point starts in 2019. 2019 was where everything exploded. Something lit a fire. So, one of the points that I've been trying to make in Hong Kong is one of our failures is that we haven't, after 1997, spent enough time to really understand the Chinese system and learn our way of how to actually have effective discussion with China. From their point of view, they're going to say, we gave you many, many, many opportunities. So, as I said, my last point is, I don't think we can just regard them as evil, or that they'll never listen to us, or we do not want to be a part of China. I think we take them seriously, and that ultimately is for people in Hong Kong who are going to stay here for the long term, to beat down a path and to find a way to deal with it.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. It's also interesting. I mean, quite a few people I spoke to asked the question, why was China so restrained? And why did it take 2019 for China to actually come in? China could have intervened and cracked down on the protesters much earlier, even in 2014, the umbrella demonstration. It could have dispatched the 5,000 Chinese soldiers permanently stationed in Hong Kong. Yet the mighty China waited till June 2020 to pass a national security law. So it's interesting, and it's, I think, useful for us to try and understand what China's calculation is in its actions, in its orientation. Clearly, I don't think it's in China's interest, or I don't think they see it in anyone's interest to have Hong Kong lose its potential to be a shining star in the global scene in terms of being a financial center, business center. I don't think that's part of his calculation, right? So, what therefore should be the option here for Hong Kong? What are the options available for Hong Kong going forward? Knowing very well that China at this point in time is not going to be pulling back. So, what are the options? What are the real options available for Hong Kong going forward in practical terms?
Well, we do need new people who are prepared to be in public life. We need people who are clear about what we want for Hong Kong. Do we still want to push for constitutional reform? I think the answer is yes, but we might have to be a bit patient about it. Secondly is, how do we continue to be the most liberal part of China? China has laid down some red lines about secession and, narratives about independence and so on. And where are these red lines? How can Hong Kong discuss where these red lines are in a way that we can. So, I mean, there's no clear answer to all of this. However, it does require a hard head and a strong heart to continue to have these discussions, and not just by one or two people, but to be able to engage Hong Kong people in thinking about this in a way that is not so threatening to Beijing. This is very high political skills. Whether we have it in us or not, whether at this time we are able to do that or not, I don't know. But I'd like to see a new group of people, perhaps younger people, coming into public life who are willing to have a go at this.
Thank you. Jason, Brian, Johnson, any response to that? To what Christine has put on the table?
What Christine was saying, Hong Kong, no matter whether we agree or not, because the red line are there, we are still the most liberal part of China as of today. That is true. I think somehow, although we have been talking about there's no way to go back to the past, but at the same time, we also need to remember how the Hong Kong story, the Hong Kong miracle happened. It's like we are playing the gateway of China to connect it with the world. And we are probably a softer or lighter versions of the Chinese institutions that can make a showcase to the foreign friends and whatever. I think Hong Kong can still play the role to have an easier platform for the international community to tap into the Chinese market. As long as we can resume our stability, at the same time, we can still make sure, although the red lines already there over our head, but for most part of our life, everyone can still do their daily life in a normal way. But of course, if we push the discussions of the freedom of speech or the whatever things that touching the red line, then it's getting a bit touchy. But I would say in terms of being financial centers or whatever, there's still a big door open for Hong Kong.
Right. Thank you, Jason. Yes, Johnson?
In terms of the red line, I will just reiterate, what have happened in China, where when lawyers were seeking procedural justice, not to challenge the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, they are also touching somehow the red line. So I'm not sure how we can navigate that. We might need people who are very wise, who understand China a lot, to tell us how to navigate that. But I guess what is important is I see political outcome as the sum of different parties holding up their principles and expressing their position. It's like playing tango or in a relationship, right? In a relationship, especially a romantic one, you don't just unconditionally comply with what your counterpart wants, because that will ultimately become abuses. So maintaining your own unique identity, and most importantly, your principle, and in my case, or in many Hong Kong people case, the pursuit of freedoms and democracy is something that we have to grab on. And how to do it? A lot of time, I believe, political changes doesn't need charity of the regimes or those in power. Citizen-led initiative could also play a role in here, meaning creating maybe space for reconciliation, keep on seeking truth, restoring institutional protections to human rights in whatever way we can, or something that I will focus on. Because I'm not in institution, and I don't think many people in Hong Kong are in a position to, lobby the government. We might need someone who has, that kind of political elasticity.
Right. So
to do it.
And that's very interesting what you just said, Johnson, because I do think it does appear that you do need people who understand the partisan perception, the understanding and thinking of of Beijing, and therefore maybe fresh blood, people who have the know-how, people who don't have baggage. I mean, these are various ways in which you can get people to be heard, for Hong Kong to be heard. At this juncture, Christina, I'd like to quote from an article that you wrote in South China Morning Post in November 2020. And you said, and I quote, Hong Kong politics have been trapped in a good versus evil narrative that does not advance Hong Kong's interest. Between now and the next legislative election in the autumn of 2021, pro-establishment legislators have the opportunity to show us, meaning the people of Hong Kong, their best side. This is a very interesting point, that you want to move away from a binary narrative of good versus evil, because nobody wins in these kind of situations, with these kind of narratives. Would you care to elaborate on this?
Right. Well, the situation even then, what we saw was the legislature would be dominated by the pro-establishment camp. And today we now see that they'll absolutely dominate. I think the issue really is, and so what are they going to do for the people of Hong Kong? How are they going to resolve some of the housing and social problems, the youth issues that other speakers today have talked about? Are they going to be able to show us that they have the ability to do that? I would say that's a minimum. And in the past, I think we have a very...
when you say they,
the pro-establishment camp.
Okay. And the legislators.
Yes. I mean, know, the legislature, it's going to be dominated completely by pro-government camp, right?
Yes.
So, but the point is, if you're sitting in Beijing, you're saying, okay, we've cleared out the Democrats who were filibustering all the time and we never got anything done, right?
Right.
So we are not going to have that excuse anymore. You're going to have a group of people who should be there to help solve problems in a sensible way, right? So I think Hong Kong people, even, for those who are not pro-establishment, they're going who are pro-establishment but not part of the government structure, they're going to be demanding performance. So actually, this is another high bar that is being set, and it'll be very interesting to see whether they rise to it. Now, the other point is, Beijing seems to be interested to rally people who maybe I can call them moderates. They're new faces. They're not your traditional pro-establishment camp. Are there new faces under Chinese sovereignty who are loyal, who are prepared to step in and be in public office?
Right. And moving away from the binary narrative conflict, right, which you highlighted, good versus evil, it actually allows us to see the strength of the adversary, so to speak, instead of defining that person as the group as adversary. For example, right, you highlighted in another, Christine, you highlighted in another article that President Xi Jinping sent 775,000 officials in 2016 all across China to identify and implement location-specific solutions. And you said the Chinese Communist Party was able to announce in 2020 that between 1980 and 2020, China successfully lifted a staggering 800 million people out of poverty. So clearly, China is not all evil. China is would be in a position to help Hong Kong deal with some of the stubborn problems that you've been facing. Housing, for example, poverty, that Brian talked about. So, working together, finding ways to work together, and that requires building trust, would actually pave the way for a new era of prosperity. Brian, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much, Vishwa. I just want to chime in here with the observation, perhaps, and it's a pretty poignant, but I think fundamentally it's a reality that there's more unites. Proverbially you've got the yellow and the blue, right? The yellow is the pro-democracy side, blue is the pro-establishment side in Hong Kong. I think there's more that unites yellow and blue when it comes to the core interests and also a lot of the core values that they harbour, apart from those on the extreme ends, than we often give either side credit for. Both yellow and blue are disillusioned, dissatisfied with a government or governance at large has played out. Both find it fundamentally, breathtakingly despicable. Exorbitant housing crises and youth that are deprived of opportunities, staved off jobs, and who lack the ability to achieve sociability. And I think both sides ultimately agree that 2019 was, for lack of a better word, and excuse my language, a hell of a dumpster fire. You know, I don't think anyone should have emerged from 2019 as a Hong Konger feeling, wow, that was a great year. You know, apart from those who genuinely cared very little for this city, had nothing to do with it, and had experienced the scenes and episodes that we all endured. It was a traumatizing year, and the aftermath and the effects of that till this very day. But a question I want to ask here is, if you see a house that's burning, we can argue and quibble over who started the fire. You know, a bit of Billy Joel here. We didn't start the fire. You didn't start the fire. He started the fire. But at the end of the day, the question becomes, at some point, how can we put out the fire? And I think that's the question where we inevitably have to confront political realities and work with what we're given. I call this constrained optimization. Now, some folks would say these constraints are immoral. Others would say we can wiggle free and wrest ourselves free of these constraints. And still some others would say we should repudiate any and all constraints by standing there and talking about who started the fire. All of these are perfectly respectable approaches. I do not mean to castigate or to criticize or to criticize, because I have neither the moral capacity nor the ability to do so. I don't want to do so pontificating from high ground. But the reality is, if we want to solve the problem and solve the puzzle, we need all hands on deck, like it or not. And I think that's ultimately the question of how we ought to move forward, I think, is worth our considering. Thanks, Vishwa.
Right. Yeah, all hands on deck. That's an interesting point. I gather that Cyril, you had a point, and James from the audience, you had a point to make.
Yes, thanks. Some great points from everyone. I guess I'm a journalist, and one thing I find very frustrating in Hong Kong is the access to information and access to officials. And I think it doesn't really help when they hide behind the sort of cut and paste statements that they always give out whenever we try to get in touch with them. And it's actually very hard to get a either as a journalist or as a citizen, and to actually, have a frank exchange. Now, I think, was it Christine who mentioned something about, we want to have an Asian solution, and perhaps we don't want people to lose faith, and, perhaps it's better to have
Christine didn't say that.
Who said that? Somebody said something like that, I think.
Yeah, but I think I interpreted that, but Christine didn't say that in so many words.
Oh, okay. But anyway, I think, the idea of backroom discussions, I think really we've got to get away from. And I was actually invited to a backroom discussion, as it were, in 2019, I think. I was one of those that was selected to come and talk to the government as part of sort of dialogue, and I met with the Environment Secretary, or Under Secretary as he is, and I didn't really appreciate it, to be honest, because I wanted to talk about environmental issues, and he wanted to ask me what I thought about Carrie Lam's leadership. So there was a massive disconnect there, because I don't really care, honestly, too much about Carrie Lam's leadership. I care about, the environmental issues that I fight for day by day. And I want him to communicate those to Carrie Lam and say, look, this is what people care about. Not, oh, Carrie Lam, you need to have better dialogue with the people or stuff like that. So I did feel that, we do need to have a better dialogue with government, and it needs to be more open. And officials need to be less afraid to actually come out and say things to the press.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone agrees with that, or has a comment on that. I'll be interested to hear.
Yeah, interesting point. Any of the panelists would like to respond to James's point in his question?
I think I hear James saying, I think the Hong Kong government can be much, much better in its communication. And one thing about communication is to be able to to be willing to communicate and talk to all sorts of people. Secondly is the point about, perhaps behind the scenes, discussion. I think this happens all over the world. It's very difficult. I don't know whether the speaker was talking about, having all discussions in public, and I don't think that is actually what he means. But anyway, I won't guess exactly what he means.
Right. Anyone else from the panel?
I'm
Cyril?
now in. Can you? Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was interested much earlier on in the exchanges that Christine suggested perhaps examples in Asia, rather than taking the Western liberal approach, legalistic approach. And here I would like to point out the very strong examples of how South Korea and Taiwan transited from extreme authoritarian, militaristic, dictatorial regimes to the kind of almost chaotic democracy they have now, but which are very strong institutions with public participation. Perhaps if we studied the process of the transition from extreme authoritarianism and militaristic authoritarianism to what they have become now, there might be something for Hong Kong to adapt or learn from. One other point I would like to go back to is Viswa, in your summary of the 179 years of Hong Kong history, you mentioned that the Hong Kong and New Territories agreements were to expire in 1997 in terms of return to sovereignty of China. But actually, no. Hong Kong Island per se was granted in perpetuity to Britain. It was only the New Territories beyond Boundary Street of Kowloon that was subject to the lease. So Hong Kong legally was British territory handed in perpetuity with no time limit. Just a point of historical correction.
Well, I stand corrected, because the literature that I read gave the version that I articulated earlier. But thank you, Cyril, for that clarification.
Yeah, the Chinese never recognized any of those treaties signed under pressure. Now, let me just talk about Asian examples. So, for example, I'm looking for those where there are difficult situations where the government and society were able to take them forward. So, obviously the complete transformation of society, that is interesting for everyone. So in Singapore, I understand some years ago, there were efforts made for very widespread discussion within society. What was the kind of process? How was it built upon? If we were to take another society, I don't know, right, whether there were any kind of discussion in other societies in Asia. Are there any discussion in Japan? I'm looking for processes where people could start to have difficult conversation.
Yes. I can talk to you, I can share with you that in Singapore, there was when the fourth generation leaders came to the fore, there was this national conversation, and the jury is still out as to whether it was effective or not, whether it was just symbolic, whether the government was willing to listen, whether it was a wasted process, and so on. But there was this national conversation that took place over 12 months. But when you talk about difficult conversations, I think there's one going on even as we speak now about race, about racism and casual racism and so on, as a result of a few incidents. This, I think, is more of an acid test, whether we as a society, a multiracial society, we are comfortable enough to talk about these things without, sort of skirting the issues. So far, the conversations have been quite open, honest, and very encouraging. So, yes, I think Singapore and some of the conversations we've been having lately, especially because we're transiting into the fourth generation of leaders, is probably going to be quite instructive and quite useful for Hong Kong to study. I think Claudelia, you have a question or point. I saw you put up your hand earlier.
Okay, hi everybody. Yep.
Hi.
Actually, just wanting to have a few questions. I have these thoughts in my head. To what extent can Hong Kong continue to leverage or rely on their status as being the gateway of China going forward? And today, right, both China and US are trying very hard to posture for both sides of the Pacific. So actually, what can Hong Kong do to leverage from the current situation and actually emerge stronger as a result? So this is one I have. The second thing that I would like to ask is, to what extent would maybe hypothetically, certain economic structures or stabilizations or measures, being put in to breach economic disparities, which is, based on what I hear, one of the most, frustrating and worrying aspects that people are going through, right? Would these, be enough to satiate the current narratives in Hong Kong? Does it seem like Hong Kong government is having a paralysis at this moment in time as they try to navigate how much political influence that they can have on their own to make certain decisions by themselves at this moment in time? Thank you.
Claudelia, when you say economic differences, are you talking inequities?
Yes. Socio-economic
inequities.
inequalities. Yes, correct.
All right. Okay. Panelists, anyone wants to respond to this, to Claudelia? Brian, yes, please go ahead.
Just seeing if I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Great. Sorry, I just switched my Wi-Fi. So look, I think you raised a very fair and valid point. And in an ideal world, the Hong Kong government, whilst notwithstanding the fact that the city is a part of China, of course, the country, should be able to offer not just a gateway for China to access the world, but also an opportunity for an alternative set of cultural mores and values to essentially infuse themselves with the rest of China, like Shanghai has offered over the past 40 years through Haipai Wenhua, which is essentially a distinctive blend of Shanghainese culture that blends Western cosmopolitanism with international ideals, with Chinese patriotism and whatnot. But that's in an ideal world. And the reality is, the Hong Kong government, they're doing the task that they have at hand, has a gargantuan task at hand of convincing the international community that, in terms of the law, in terms of its economics, it remains distinctive from the mainland. Yet at the very same time, in pitching to Beijing, as it really should, that the best means of resolving and assuaging the worries of Hong Kongers is to have that unique sense of cultural mores and values that have always been instilled and been entrenched in Hong Kong, be the ultimate framework under which transformations and reforms are carried out. This is what the government must do. Can the government do it? Can the administration succeed? That's a question for which the jury's still out. And I honestly hope, as I said previously, that all hands are on deck. Civil society actors, moderate Democrats, folks in the establishment, folks who are sympathetic towards keeping Hong Kong as an international city, who care for one country and two systems, to fight on for that goal, to ensure that reforms come into place, that maintain that balance, that ensures that Hong Kong not only serves the rest of its very own country, China, but also serves Hong Kongers. Because that's ultimately what governance is about. And I think that's incredibly important.
Right. And also it's quite evident from the discussion so far that it is not in Beijing's interest to see Hong Kong fail. Edward Pop in.
Yep. Hi, this is Edward from Hong Kong. We can see that Beijing's red line toward Hong Kong has constantly been shifting, depending on the situation in the city. So the general scenario is that someone might think the restrictions of liberalism in Asia's financial hub, which holds $11 trillion of cross-border investments, would trigger panic, capital flight, and a business exodus. But indeed, we could see there is a pattern of political restrictions alongside a financial boom in the city recently. Share offerings have soared as China's leading companies list here. Western firms are in the thick of it. Like last year, the value of the US dollar payments cleared in Hong Kong hit a whack of 11 trillion US dollars. So the question I would like to raise is whether it is really a thing for Beijing to preserve the Western kind of liberalism in Hong Kong. So how do Hong Kong people or the moderate reformists in Hong Kong respond to that? So given this situation, what are the incentives for the Beijing authority to relieve the tension with those Hong Kong Democrats? I mean, I'm very delighted to see any dialogue happening in Hong Kong in the coming future, but are there any model answers to persuade Democrats in the city to go with this way? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Christine, would you? I think you're the most experienced person to comment to respond to Edward's question.
Well, I think first of all, the moderates need to ask themselves if they want to be in frontline politics, and I hope they do. Secondly, is they need to ask themselves where they stand on some of these issues. Can they function in a situation of some ambiguity? Thirdly is Hong Kong is a part of China, and so we have no choice in Hong Kong but to consider how to be that very privileged part of China. If we want to hold on to the one country, two systems and basic law, because those are systems that other Chinese cities would die for. So I think it's very important for us to be able to hold different ideas or things that are difficult for us. Our preference is perhaps for a kind of more liberal Western approach, but yet we are a part of socialist China. How can we make the best of that? And for those in particular who wish to be in public life, who wish to be in political life, this is a very high order, a very great challenge, and we have a great necessity to have these brave souls actually step forward to try and do what they can. In the language of Brian, who says the ultimate test is, are they able to serve the people of Hong Kong with good governance and a relaxed and liberal way of life that is perhaps not the United States or the United Kingdom.
That's very well put, I must say. And I'm afraid we've come to the end of the discussion. I wish we could continue for a few more minutes, but we've already extended by 15 minutes. My own sense is, really what Christine said earlier, and what was highlighted in some other conversations in this, that I think the time has come for Hong Kong, the people of Hong Kong, regardless of socioeconomic class, regardless of background, to actually come together, come forward, and develop a new narrative. And this new narrative, cannot be a zero-sum narrative in relation to Beijing, because that's not going to work, and what Christine, you said in your article, it's, you can't see it as good versus evil, but really it has to start with some hope. It has to start with an acknowledgement of the good that Beijing can bring to Hong Kong if you can find a way to work together. So what's clear from our discussion today is that the etchings of the Hong Kong that we have all come to know are fast fading. The new Hong Kong is certainly emerging, and how the transition takes place is very much in the hands of the people of Hong Kong. It is. And it could be smooth and mediatory in tone or imposed with a hard fist. One thing is clear, the principle of two systems will be suspended if Beijing feels its sovereign interests are threatened. So the ball is very much in Hong Kong's court, not China's. My sincere appreciation to our four outstanding panelists, Christine, Brian, Jason, and Johnson. And also thanks to our youth panelists, Jenny, Tanushree, and Pochen. And thank you all for making time to join us. I'd like to end by quoting what my good friend Brian Wong said most eloquently in his June 27th article in Nikkei Asia. It not only makes sense, it is spoken in the voice of Hong Kong's youth, a voice of belief and commitment. And I quote, "Those pushing for change must find ways to work and progressive members of the city's establishment work with progressive members of the city's establishment to identify and advance reforms in areas where Beijing's and Hong Kong's interests converge. The coalition of people and groups that can bring change on such a scale lies beyond the conventionally defined elites. The more the international community tries to force Beijing's hand, the less likely it is that China will soften its stance. The short-term prognosis may be ugly. For those who still live here, we will not give up on fixing this city and repairing its relations with its own country, China. The message to Beijing and the rest of the world is, do not write us off just yet." This has been IQ International. Thank you and good night.